So we got to get into our panel. We got a lot of ground to cover. NATO's a big topic, but I need to round out our panel, kind of from your right to left. Ambassador Kurt Volker, my old boss when he ran the McCain Institute, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, former special envoy to Ukraine, just came back from Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. Has made as many trips as any American probably has to Ukraine. Probably selling him short, but there's a bit of an intro there. And General Michel-Henri St. Louis, now the Attaché for Canada in Washington, D.C., and before that was acting commander of the Canadian Army, and he and I share a little bit of common history in Afghanistan going back, so has been right in the thick of things on NATO operations. We already got a stellar introduction of the general here, and we have Rear Admiral Jakob, and I'll say this wrong with my Hick, Arkansas accent. He said I could say Rousøe, but that's not exactly quite right. It's more like Rousøe, or saying it not exactly quite right, but Royal Danish Defense Attaché to the U.S., Canada, and Denmark, so covering down on 3 countries, and unbelievable career, but brings exceptional knowledge of industry and logistics, right? Still hear it said out there, logistics is professionals, tactics and strategy sometimes can be for amateurs. That's of course not true, but good gosh, you need to have that side of it. And he brings that much more in spades. So hopefully I haven't sold you too short, but there's our panel. The right folks to talk about NATO at 75. And, I guess we could have a panel and say, hey, NATO at 75, quite a milestone, let's slap ourselves on the backs and say good job, but I think really we hopefully can all agree that it's how NATO becomes an octogenarian, it's how NATO becomes 80 and steps towards being 80 that's most important. So I think it's a forward-looking panel is really what we want to focus on. And you think about it, 75 years of NATO, 100 years of the Connecticut World Affairs Council. I mentioned that New York Times headline from 75 years ago on today. We're the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and folks like General Marshall, who then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, says, look, we need to really focus on Europe lest the Soviet Union crush democracy. That's interesting. That's 75 years ago, but we are here today. So I have a series of questions. You don't want to hear any more from me, I don't think, but I thought it might be useful since Ukraine is kind of the elephant in the room. Any of these individuals would be qualified to speak on that, but with Kurt having just come back and with his position there, for him to give us his take on that as a start.
Well, thanks very much, Luke, and it's great to be here. I think to frame the issue of NATO and as it relates to Ukraine, I'd say the first thing is that NATO is successful and incredibly effective at protecting its members. There haven't been attacks on NATO members other than the 9/11 attacks in the U.S. that have called NATO to exercise Article 5. That's because NATO has always been strong enough and capable enough to deter anybody from attacking, so that any potential attacker would know they're going to be destroyed, so they don't do it. That's the great thing about NATO, and it is still important, and it still works. And it ensures that the United States is not alone in a world of authoritarians, but it is a democracy, a market economy, a power in the world that has allies. And we have right now 31 allies in Canada and in Europe, which makes a better world. It makes the United States stronger. It makes more peace in the world and so forth. That's the good news. The bad news is that when it comes to maintaining peace and security in Europe generally, this worked during the Cold War when it was a bipolar situation, but we saw war break out in Yugoslavia in the 90s, but NATO stepped in to intervene to stop that. But now we have the largest war going on in Europe since World War II, and NATO did not deter it. We didn't prevent it. We didn't convince Putin that we would support Ukraine. He felt that he had an opportunity to go in and rebuild the Russian Empire. And that's literally how he describes it. He compares himself to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and an accumulator of Russian lands, and says that he's rebuilding the empire. And we didn't prevent it. So now we're in a situation where there's an active war going on in Europe, much harder to put back in the box than when you're maintaining a peace. And the trick that we have now is to help Ukraine survive, make sure it defends itself successfully against Russia, to the point that Putin realizes it's a fool's errand, that he's never going to succeed in taking over Ukraine, eliminating Ukraine as a people, a national identity as a country, and that he's only weakening Russia in the process. And if we can get Putin to that point where he believes that, then that can be an end to the war. And then we have to go about the business of rebuilding a peace. Then we have to make sure there isn't a future war. And that, I think, means we're going to have to take steps to close down these gray zones in Europe, where Putin has felt that he can attack Georgia and get away with it. He can occupy part of Moldova and get away with it. He can attack Ukraine, and he thought he would get away with it. So when we see whatever the solution is, whatever the peace turns out to be from the immediate Russia war against Ukraine, that then has to be turned into a restoration of European peace. And that's going to require NATO. It's going to require a clear border that we will protect so that we deter future attacks, as NATO has done successfully for 75 years.
Okay, thanks for that, Kurt. We're going to do more than just Ukraine, but I think it's appropriate to give you a chance, to jump in here. And my question is, how has the prolonged conflict, I believe Admiral Lundy called it the unchecked aggression from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, changed you and your country security focus? And I will just go, straight down the line.
Well, glad you start with Romania. That's not just the geography and priority, but and thank you for having the ambassador here coming with a message from Ukraine and what NATO represents today. 2 or 3 points to your question. I don't think it changed much because you're talking about the anniversary of the alliance, and this is first of all an anniversary of common values. Yes, it did transform the alliance, especially in the military architecture. For the last year I had the privilege to work with Jakob as Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe and also the commander of EUCOM. The cultural change of the military architecture of NATO was very much at his focus point in changing and adapting the plans, command and control, the executability, so everything about how we do things today and in the future in the face of a toxic and chronic Russia. And to that point, do we have any Ukrainians in the room? No? There's one?
There's a lady.
Can I ask you to stand up?
Stand up, please.
Can I ask you to stand up?
They're getting embarrassed.
Well, can we give them a round of applause for what they're doing here? Thank you. Going back to your question. So it hasn't changed much, but it adapted the military capacity of the alliance to respond to this. Deterrence still matters, and it matters, again, in that change, not just for the eastern posture, so it's not just between Poland and Romania, Baltic and the Black Sea. You can see some of the toxic actions today in the Arctic. Oh, by the way, something showed up just before the summit in Washington. Guess where? Near Cuba. Mm-hmm. And this was like deja vu for some of us. So I don't want you to focus on Russia being toxic just in the eastern flank or front, as we call it. No, this is going deep, and this is going the whole 360. So that's number two. The alliance addressed this very much to a 360 dimension. Number three, and I'll close with part of my answer for your question, but I think it adapted a little bit the culture of the U.S. military also. It raises some question for how they optimize the presence and the posture, guess what, between the Pacific and Europe at the same time. And this used to be, in some of the schools, we learned that America had this as a foundation of strategy, even a grand strategy. How do you fight two major theaters of war? And I think this was the time for U.S. to, together with the allies, to determine what's that optimization. And it has to be simultaneous. So I think part of the answer is there. Within this, like to underline that I was here for the last couple of days with the National Guard from Connecticut and our state partnership friends and brothers from Alabama, Romania and Alabama, their state partnership for the last 30 years. And that's a different source of how you protect the common values and how you adapt in terms of contributing capabilities to the response of toxic Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral?
Yeah, thank you. Despite what my good colleague here said, so in Denmark, it was a significant change. Since my career, and I know I look like I'm 25, but I've been in the Navy for I've been in the Navy for more than 25 years. So all my time it's been about budget cuts and how to do more with less. But since the Ukraine crisis, that significantly changed. The Danish politicians, they changed completely their take on security. Days after Russia went into Ukraine, the fifth biggest and oldest political parties in Denmark made what they called a national compromise and got together, said that they would now meet the NATO targets. They will go beyond that. They agreed on a significant big portion of money that they wanted to donate to Ukraine, and together with a lot of donations from the military. And they agreed to get rid of the EU ops that we had with regards to defense. So we became a full member of the EU with regards to that. And that was put out for a national election to vote that in, and that was done just months after the Russian aggression. So that completely changed the whole dynamics in Denmark. We are now full and unconditionally almost supporting Ukraine. We're one of the countries that has been donating, despite the size of our country, the most to Ukraine with military equipment. We are still doing that. We are now running out of equipment that we can provide, but then we're beginning to find new ways. One of them is to stipulate the Ukrainian industrial base and buy stuff from the Ukrainian industry and give it to the Ukrainian military forces, which has a significant impact because I was just sitting 2 days ago with the Ukrainian defense attaché in Washington, and he said to me, this is just what we want because it does quite a few good things. One is that obviously it's helped them ramp up their industrial base, but it also provides them equipment that they know, so they can repair it not only in Ukraine but also at the very front of the battle. And the third thing is that it actually also attracts Ukrainians that are abroad to come back to Ukraine and get jobs. So there are ways that we can support, and that's something that I think is extremely important. At the same time, the focus we have now on ramping up the capabilities in our own forces to meet NATO capabilities targets has completely changed also, and the urgency of doing that quickly is of the utmost important. So that bit, focusing also on the NATO burden sharing and appreciating that Europe, the members from Europe needs to do more and be able to look much more after our own safety and security and not only rely on the US is something that has really changed since this happened. So I think I'll say that for that one.
Thank you. Very good.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I feel so excited to be back at the Global Security Forum. I've been invited twice, and that's more than I can say from when I speak at home. They don't want to hear from me again. So I feel very blessed to have been invited again. It's great to see some friendly faces and to be on this panel. Somewhat intimidating to me, sitting with an ambassador to NATO, a senior general who has served in NATO with SACEUR right now, and a professional in logistics, which I'm the amateur on the chairs. I'm the infanteer who doesn't know anything. So please apologize at the start from my missteps or my French accent. It is significant, the amount of change the war in Ukraine has caused in Canada's view, Canadians' view, our government's view on defense and security. Very much akin to what you just heard from our friend from Denmark, because we have the luxury of geography. We have the luxury of not being Romania, in the place in the world where our enemies are far away. At least they are today. 1812, they might have been our neighbors, might have been you folks. But we kind of settled that, called it a draw, and moved on from that. We can argue about that at the break. I think we won, but hey, that's not the topic. Canada has been blessed by its geography, its three oceans, its best friend to the south. And most Canadians would say that our requirement to spend on security and defense was not first and foremost undermined. What Russia did to Georgia years ago, what it did to Ukraine in 2014, what it has done 2 years ago, what China has done to challenge international norms, arbitrarily detain Canadians, interject themselves in our elections processes in a number of Western democracies, the challenge that Russia, China, and others pose to an opening Arctic. You heard about it from the admiral from the Coast Guard and the ambassador. All of those things are contributing to make Canadians kind of change their mindset. I joined a military that was focused on the Cold War, that was focused on readiness, countering Russia, and then we won the Cold War when I arrived as a lieutenant. So when I was sitting, like you folks in a room, was fired up about going to Germany and being ready to fight tonight, I had my orders. I was going to LAR, the premier brigade that Canada had in the army. And in February, we won. My government says, no need for LAR, we're pulling out of Germany, and I'm going to Quebec City. I've been there before. I was kind of disappointed. Not that I was itching for a fight, but as a lieutenant, the world changed, and we doubled down on the peace dividend. Canada cashed its tokens on peace and the promise of it, integrating Cold War countries, bringing them into NATO, becoming friends with Russia, and thinking that there was a future in which our liberal values, our democratic values would make us all work together for a better economy, and China would rise without challenging our norms. Canada has changed its mind. For the first time in an election, in surveys, security and defense are in the top 10 concerns for Canadians. They were not before this. For the first time, Canadians would be willing and are willing to do more. And as such, our government has issued a new Indo-Pacific strategy where we clearly label China a rising adversary that is disrupting our international norms that yield our respective prosperity. We have issued a new defense policy. We have developed plans to reach 2%. We have suddenly announced at the NATO summit that we will explore the purchase of 12 new submarines to patrol Fortress North Atlantic and the Arctic. I have never been in a military that has had 12 submarines. You folks in the Navy have that at every base, I know.
Plenty of folks in Hartford that want to talk to you about submarines too. I'm sure you know that.
So there is, in the recent years, this government purchased F-35s. This government has been in office for 3 election cycles. They might have come on a platform of not necessarily thinking we needed F-35s. They purchased P-8s, MQ-9 Bravo Predators, and air refueling platforms. We are increasing our footprints in NATO through a brigade strength force in Latvia. And we have the whole policy update yields 2%, if not more, by 2030. So that is not the military I joined. I joined the military like my Danish Rear Admiral about cuts, about doing more with less. And this is a different time for us. And I would correlate that change to what we are seeing happening in Ukraine right now.
Okay, well, Kurt, I'm going to start with you again on this next one. You can tag in anything you want, but I mean, change mindsets, steadfast resolve is, I think, what I'm picking up there. Integrated deterrence and looking at capability that stops aggression, checks aggression before it becomes unchecked, I suppose, right? As a new lieutenant in Germany and then later as a major, I still probably too simplistically thought of NATO as kind of tanks and AWACS. I mean, knowing it was more than that, right? But I don't think that's what we have now, right? I mean, tanks are a little more vulnerable than they used to be with drones. I'm sure AWACS are important. I mean, what does integrated deterrence look like? And I probably have always sold short kind of the diplomatic and economic aspect of that as well. So, Kurt, do you want to lead us off, or we can?
Well, it's a tough one. I think the way to get about thinking about this is to think about what Russia is doing. Russia is NATO's principal security concern, China also, but principally Russia. And Russia is engaging in hybrid attacks against NATO every day. These are cyber attacks, they are disinformation campaigns, bribery in our political systems, corruption, election interference, targeted assassinations, paid for demonstrations and protests that go on, sometimes beating up people, as they did, Leonid Volker, who was in Lithuania, Navalny's deputy living in exile, they go track him down and beat him up. So that is all different from, tanks and artillery. They are also doing tanks and artillery, and they're doing, MiG-29s, they're doing Su-34s, they basically took dumb bombs and attached GPS to them to make them smarter, and now they're glide bombs, and they're able to attack from within Russian territory, but attack inside Ukraine. So the spectrum of things that Russia is doing is very, very broad. And when we think about NATO and defense, what we've realized is that NATO is not deterring these things. We have deterred the tank attack on Germany. That worked. But these other sorts of nefarious activities that Russia engages in every day, we have done the opposite. We've tried to avoid escalation, we've tried to avoid confrontation, and Russia takes advantage of that to keep going. So it's playing all of these games. Ukraine is in the situation where it is getting the full force of everything. They're getting the bombs, they're getting the artillery, they're getting the wave after wave of infantry and so on. So Ukraine has had to innovate dramatically. They have limited resources. They don't have the US military, they have the Ukrainian military. So they've had to develop new classes of drones, particularly cheap ones, so that they can make lots of them. They've had to develop naval drones because they don't have a navy per se, not a blue water navy, so they've had to disrupt the Russian navy through naval drones that they've built. They've had to really up their game in electronic warfare, both offensive and defensive. They have adapted systems that we've given them. For instance, we've given them Bradley fighting vehicles, and they're vulnerable to Russian armed drone attacks. And so they've come up with a system for putting a fence, like a mesh fencing, around the Bradley to blunt the impact of a drone-borne explosive so that it doesn't incapacitate the vehicle. So they've had to adapt and adapt and adapt. even with good stuff that we've given them, and they've had to figure out how to do things more and more cheaply. I would argue that that is what NATO's going to have to learn. We need to learn this from the Ukrainians and maybe improve it. But when you think about U.S. defense industry, we make super sophisticated, super capable, and incredibly expensive military equipment. And if the Ukrainians can have a similar result for 1/100th of the price, it becomes cost ineffective to do what we're doing. And we're going to have to learn from the Ukrainians how to do things more innovatively and cheaper, because that's what the Chinese are going to do. That's what the Middle East powers, Iran and others that we're going to deal with, they're going to do these things. The Russians are learning from the Ukrainians. So this is where NATO's going to have to go, I think. NATO's going to have to become a much more tech-savvy and nimble military force if we're going to deter in the future the way we've been able to deter in the past.
So, General Seneley, maybe pick up on any of that you want. I know Canada is proudly part of the Diana accelerated innovation effort within NATO. Whatever you'd like to tell us more about.
I would agree and disagree with the ambassador. That's a dangerous place to be, especially sitting right beside him. I think integrated deterrence is different than previous deterrence and needs to change, but I also think it might be just putting a different label on what has always been done. I talked to you a little bit about the world I joined when I was recently commissioned, the world I served in as a lieutenant and captain, quickly deploying to places that were falling apart, like Yugoslavia, or where we were fighting to defend our national interests, like Afghanistan. We used the term whole-of-government approach. And it was a whole-of-government effort where the instruments of power of our governments, our respective governments, working in coalitions, were trying to get after that defense of our national interests. I would say where it has changed is, I think this sense when you read your own strategies and policies about the need recognized in the United States that deterrence alone based on the amount of AWACS, the amounts of tanks, to win against a Soviet Union, that is not enough. The label and the application of it needs to be different. It needs to be your ability to defend your network. It needs to be your space constellations and their integrity. It needs to be your economic security. It needs to be the ability to incur cost or the threat of cost to your adversary, not just by the threat of invasion or destruction by nuclear weapons. I think it is a recognition, though, that the U.S. cannot do it alone. And there is a number of like-minded nations that are aligning themselves under this similar view of maintaining or protecting this international-based order, these norms that yield our prosperity, and wanted to work together to be additive in our respective capabilities to deter. When we look back and either criticize or are very we look at ourselves on the failure of Ukraine and not being able to deter Russia. And I feel for Ukraine every day. I applaud the people that stood up here as they are here in a conference in beautiful Hartford, and their country has been at war for 2 years. We think about that failure, but NATO did not fail in the sense that no NATO country has been invaded by another state actor. A non-state actor attacked one of our countries, and all of the countries came together and incurred a cost on them for doing that. So I might take a slightly different view. Going forward, I would suggest one last point about the challenge of that American leadership in integrated deterrence. While as an individual and an infantry officer, I see a lot of benefit and clarity of using all the instruments, having additive deterrence value when you use them together as a government, as a coalition, or an alliance. I would maybe put a warning signal on the fact that not everyone sees the threat and the adversary the same way. For deterrence to work, we need to start with an acceptance that Russia is the threat, or maybe China is the threat. And that nuance, like you heard the clarity of previous panels, right? First line in the CNO's statement, 2027, China. Number of your strategic documents, your narrative is about China being a threat. Given that I speak Spanish, I'm also a delegate of Canada at the Inter-American Defense Board, which is in DC, the hemispheric hub of Latin American militaries that come together to discuss issues in the hemisphere. If I'm in a room with Brazilian generals and Argentinian generals and Chileans and Colombians and Ecuador and Peru and Mexico, I would suggest to you the label of China as this threat is not as clear as it is in here, this country, in NATO, like-minded nations, in the Indo-Pacific, in Japan, and Australia. So that is a challenge if we are to be additive in our work together for the common good. Over.
Thank you. Admiral?
That was a lot of words.
That was additive.
That's how my guess. Yeah. Okay. So I agree with all that. One thing I would say is that deterrence it's interesting because if you look at how Putin looked at the whole operation before he kicked it off, I'm quite sure that he didn't imagine that what has happened. And you could also argue that if he had known that, he might not have done it. And if that had been the case, then we have not done our work good enough because then the deterrent didn't work. But I think one point is interesting to see what happened after the aggression, and that was that the alliance stood up, and it was even added 2 members. We are now building up. We have changed the whole, or re-looked through the regional defense plans, and there's now coming out the first new capability targets for a new NATO. I think that reaction was something that he thought never would happen. He had an idea that the Western world, and especially all the citizens in the Western world, was not interested in paying what it would cost to do these things. And I think we proved him wrong there. So moving forward and looking forward with regards to the deterrence, I think we need to be very clear that this will continue and we'll build this up and it will look like it is something that will work. And that is, I think that is the lessons that we need to learn from this, is that we actually have not been good enough to show that the Western democracies are actually really strong and that we have each other's back when something like this happened. And therefore, I think that should go into that piece of it. If I could just add also that this is then very difficult to get out there and work with. And one of the things is, now it's been said that I'm a professional logistics. That might not be true. I'm also a saltwater infantry guy, but I did logistics and procurement, and that I was very pleased to have done in my last job. And I can only encourage you guys, if you do operations, also to do that, because in the new world, the sixth dimension of our warfighting is industry. It is our ability to be able to have an industrial base that can provide equipment and capabilities to our military. If you can't do that, it's not a valid deterrent that we can showcase. So I think that bit of it is also something that we have neglected for quite a long time, but we are now beginning to ramp it up. And if you haven't, read through what was actually decided in Washington before the summer break, where we had the summit, one of the things was this NATO industrial capacity expansion pledge, which, if you read through it, that is just the things we need to get fixed. When we do that, I'm quite sure we will deter in a completely different way than we've been used to for the last 2 decades. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. General, you get the final word before we go to questions. We're going to probably take 2 or 3, 4 questions at a time, so get them ready.
No, I agree with everything. Okay, 2 or 3 points again to add to the list of important pros and cons of why integrated deterrence. I personally said, working in strategic planning and then working in NATO, that it starts with every ally, even some of the partners. So, and I don't want you to look at the mathematics, but if we know what Article 3 means and Article 5, Article 3 more of a national responsibility, Article 5 the collective defense, it has to be something like Article 3 plus 2% makes Article 5. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not the mathematics, it's the power of the message that you have to take it with every nation, and it has to go to the national responsibility that it starts with us. And that's why I mentioned about the plans and how they adapted, because now the functionality of the plans, which is important, I'm not going to get into this room about the details, but I want you to realize that deterrence was war game, was a process of determining solutions to such a threat. This is not a country with 10 soldiers or 10 tanks. This is something that has a toxic strategy, is super capacitated. And oh, by the way, another fallacy that I think, at least I had it, was we thought this is going to be a 60, 90-day blitzkrieg victory for NATO. No, this is at least 3 years. Look at Ukraine. This becomes a rhythm of consumption for the industrial base and the part of the population to have the will to fight. To that point, the part of the population, and I'm glad to see this cross-generation audience, especially with a future forward. Most of you in uniform, you have this responsibility. You have to take it to the citizen and make the citizen understand the situation. This has to be the awareness of the entire nation about what deterrence means, what does that cost, why is it needed, because most of them, they'll come back to you and say, why not give money for health, education, which are fair questions. So you really have to take the responsibility to discuss with the nation as part of your mission of the uniform. Last, look, we got the good news. I mean, we're a generation that planned, asked the tough questions, provided some of the answers, but guess who's gonna be prepared to fight it? It's you guys. And you may have activities. I mean, you will celebrate 125 years of the forum. You're going to have the centennial of NATO. That's going to mean something. And you'll have to protect that. So I'll be retired. I'll be fishing in Canada, probably.
We'll have you.
They allow me. Global climate change, nothing happens. Or even go to the north, which is wonderful. What I mean is, think about this as a long and very resource-consuming challenge and threat. This is not just a go-away crisis, the way I see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Endurance, resiliency. Okay, we have questions. Let's get 3 or 4 or 5 on the table here anyway.
Oh, God.
All right.
What did we do?
Well,
look at this.
Okay, let us know who you are, and please, let's make it a question and make it quick if you can.
Quick question. Colonel Rolf Knoll. I'm a physician. I was a senior medical officer in Bosnia in 1997. I saw Milosevic send busloads of Serbian soldiers to the border cities. They were in cities, and they created chaos in the border cities. Putin uses that playbook by sending little green men into Georgia. Now there are ethnic Russians in Moldova, they're in Latvia, they're in Georgia. What is NATO going to do when, this is his playbook, when he sends those little green men into these neighboring countries? And the second question is, Russia has 140 million people. Ukraine has 38 million people. Russia shoots 10,000 artillery shells a day, and Ukraine shoots 2,000. If you do the math, it doesn't look good for Ukraine. What is your outlook there?
Okay, so that's on the table. We'll come to that. Little green men and kind of the imbalance of mass at play. I'm just going to, you go where you can go quickest, and we'll see how many we can get here.
Gentlemen, thank you again for your time. My question relates to the SAGU and the issues of interoperability for NATO equipment. To what extent has challenges in the interoperability of NATO equipment affected Ukraine's defense efforts?
Okay, interoperability. We're going to take 2 more. We got an imbalance of West Point cadets asking questions. Okay, we'll allow it. Go ahead.
Is there a spot for Ukraine or Georgia in NATO in the coming years?
You asking me or you?
We'll see. Yeah, that one's coming your way then. Yeah, sounds like you volunteered for that one. No. All right. All right. So where NATO fits in the where Ukraine fits in the future. Let's go back. Let's go back further. Yeah, somewhere there. Yep, there we go.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm from the Consulate General of Canada, actually, in New York, so it's great to see another fellow Canadian on the panel. My questions, we talked a lot about Ukraine and Russia. We touched on the subject of China and the Indo-Pacific a little bit. So, what is NATO doing to ensure that, any lessons that we're learning from the Russia-Ukraine conflict don't get repeated with, the rise of China, its work in, its ongoing operations in the South China Sea, and, its obvious ambitions for Taiwan? And then how will NATO be working with its Indo-Pacific partners as like-minded allies in the region, like Japan and Korea, to make sure, to make sure that the lessons from the Russia-Ukraine conflict are learned in the region?
Okay, we're going to cap it there because we're probably going to run a little over time, but I guess as Emcee, I'm allowed to go maybe a minute or two, but that's pretty bad form, I suppose. Okay, we got Serbia's playbook on the table, little green men, interoperability, where Ukraine fits in the future and things like the EU and the NATO, lessons as they applicable to China and the like. Each of you get a turn to take on, as little or as much of that as you want in about a minute each. Who wants to go first? Nobody. Well, somebody has to go first. I'll pick Kurt. You're going first. All
right. I'll try to be as brief as you want me to be. Interoperability, I'm going to start there because I like to refer to the Ukrainian military as the Noah's Ark army. It's got two of everything and not enough of anything. But they've actually they're probably one of the most interoperable with NATO allies now of any partner that we've had, because they're working with all different types of equipment now. But it is a challenge militarily to provide the supplies, the maintenance for all these different types of things that they've got. It is a challenge. On Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, Ukraine, I'm convinced that as we start to see an end to this conflict, Ukrainian membership in NATO has to be part of the solution so that we don't go into another war. Putin doesn't build up and attack again. So Ukrainian NATO membership has to be part of the solution. I would like to see Georgia in NATO as well. I think we need to close down gray zones, and I think we need to send a clear signal to Putin that no more wars. Unfortunately, the Georgian government is busily pulling itself away from NATO and the European Union at the moment. They have elections on October 26th, and I think they are going to decide the fate of the country for a long time now. So that's not encouraging what we see in Georgia right now. I think the most important signal to China from Russia's war against Ukraine is yet to be sent. China's watching. If Russia succeeds, even at some cost, and the West doesn't have the resolve and the will to prevail, to help Ukraine prevail, I think China's encouraged. On the other hand, if Russia loses the war and weakens itself dramatically and leaves behind a much stronger, more resolute West and NATO, with Ukraine now part of that, that's a very different message to China, and I think they would learn a lesson from that as well, and I hope that's the message that they get. And then I want to come to the first point, because what you brought up was the one point I wanted to bring up in my notes here that I didn't bring up. Russia is engaging in a systematic effort to flip governments and create chaos and instability in the Black Sea region and the Balkans, and drive wedges in the EU and NATO. And you see this in Georgia, which we just mentioned. You see this in Moldova. You see this using Serbia as an instrument, say, for instance, in Montenegro and North Macedonia. There's an election coming up in Bulgaria, probably not as decisive this time as what's going to happen in Georgia, but it's trending the wrong way in Bulgaria at the moment. So, and then you have Hungary and Slovakia and so on inside the tent. Bulgaria, of course, is a NATO member. Montenegro is a NATO member. So there's a systematic effort here by Russia to do this, and we actually don't have a strategy. We aren't thinking proactively, how do we blunt the Russian efforts and messaging? How do we engage to produce outcomes that are going to be beneficial for the Euro-Atlantic community as a whole? We're not thinking about it, we're not resourcing it, and in some cases we're even, I would argue, we're kidding ourselves in how much we try to work with Serbia at the expense of actually working against Serbia and with our allies in the region.
That was not the fastest minute ever, but worthwhile. So we're going to go across the Atlantic and get the Romanian defense take on whatever you'd like to weigh in on.
One about the SAGU and how we help the Ukrainians. Well, I'll just give you one example. Romania just started training the first Ukrainian to-be F-16 pilots. Okay, who was the Air Force F-16 pilots? Anyone? Hands up. You want to come? No? Okay. None? Oh, that's fun. But that means something. You have to take it to every ally in the region, also the alliance in integrity, and then bring all the resources together. This started very dissipated. Now it's a very consolidated instrument to help the Ukrainians. I think it goes back to the numbers. Yes, they have millions. That's also not the point, because you can start feeling the help from the alliance and the partners. Number two for us was the question about the green men. It is subversive. You have to be prepared for this. This is unconventional. This is a large scale. This is very much coordinated. This is long term, and it goes. That's why I said you need to go to the citizen and prepare that mentality and willingness to understand that this becomes subversive.
I was asked to go fast, so here we go. Green man, how do you counter that? Is you call it out. You incur cost. Hybrid warfare lets the enemy get away with it if it is not talked about, if it allows it to confuse yourself, and if there's no cost to it. Interoperability is a challenge, but necessity is the root of all evil. When you're in a war of survival, complete war, your state is at defending itself for its survival. I will take any help I can get, and I will sort it out. And that's what Ukrainians are doing. They're sorting it out. NATO has been together for 75 years, and we can't even work together sometimes. Do not repeat that. Was that taped? I'm in trouble now. I'm getting fired. No, but we have interoperability challenges within best friends. We'd buy different equipment, different widgets, and we want to fight together. There's not even a NATO for Indo-Pacific, linking it back to your question about what are we learning. There's no NATO there. So actually the question doesn't really apply. NATO is not trying to learn what to do in order to fight in the Indo-Pacific. We are confusing a couple of things. But countries, individual countries that are working together, Australia, Japan, United States, Canada, are trying to learn from Ukraine if there is to be a fight in the Indo-Pacific. Certainly China is learning. And the question is, who is learning what? And who is preparing for what for 2027? I will try to pivot and not keep answering your questions. I was threatened with being the last word. So I would say two things. One of the things the moderator wanted us to talk about, but he didn't get to it, is does the world need more or less of the United States? What is the role of the United States in the future? So not being American, but maybe North American, I would allow myself to say that the world is better when the U.S. plays an active, humble leadership role. The world is worse when you don't. And this is not a political statement. This is not, I'm trying not to get myself in trouble. I am in uniform. But I have lived in this world in uniform for 30 years, served overseas under U.S. leadership and commanded U.S. troops at time. And the world's problems are usually solved when U.S. uses its instruments of power to coalesce the goodwill? And I would answer that question. And lastly, for the next generation of leaders, I want to say that the world needs you. Like, not just the US Coast Guard needs you. Like, Canada needs you, as we will be fighting traffic of narcotics together and defending the Arctic seaways. The Army needs you. My Army needs you to be working with you in the next fight. So for all of you that are going to serve in whatever way, I would say stick with it, because we need you. Merci beaucoup.
All right. Last word. Quickly, I know you can do it.
Yeah, well, difficult to come after Mike here. And applauses, I don't know whether I can achieve that. But anyway, here goes. Ukraine in NATO, that's not a question I can answer. That is a political thing, but we can work with Ukraine. We show that every day now. So I think they are, from a military perspective, absolutely ready to be very close to NATO. With regards to lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine crisis, with regards to China, what I said before about deterrence, being an alliance that can show that we can work together and fight together will be what is needed in order to show China that that is not a path to go down there. Let's see. Then with regards to all these green men's, and I appreciate that. The only comment I have, I've been talking to Latvia, and we have a very close bond with the Baltic countries. I'll just say there's not that many green men's up there, and I think one of the reasons is because it's a NATO country. I just want to say that that is what I think is the red line at the moment. That is, are you a NATO country? Then Russia knows that is that will be a completely different reaction that will be given, and that is deterrence. And then back to the interoperability thing, which I think is very important bit. So that pledge I was alluding to before says something about the importance of that. But it's not only that we need to be able to operate together, it's also in order to be able to speed up our procurement and implementation of new equipment processes, because what we want to is not these big massive systems that are completely locked in being updated and so on. What we want is, from a warfighter's perspective, is equipment that is open architecture, that is same standards. So not only are we able to get it to work together, but we are also able to keep the market mechanisms in the industry working, because that's what's actually been keeping us ahead of all the rest of the world for a long time. And some of that has been wrecked. And this is where I might go too far with what I'm saying, but I think some of the primes, they need to remember that, and they need to appreciate that what they need to do is to make equipment that is interoperable, but also same standards, so we can combine things. In that respect, we can get the best equipment all the time, easy replaced and easy updated. So that's that point. And I think my last thing I will say, that's just a comment to a panel before the break, and it was to Admiral Kathleen. I think you said that to all the female cadets here that they should choose wisely with regards to husbands. I say, thank God my wife didn't get that advice. Then I wouldn't be where I am now. But I also say to all your men out there, it's also important for you guys to choose wisely with regards to wife. That's it.
How about a big round of applause for our panel, helping us get NATO to 80.